There's something quietly strange about the stories we think we know from the Middle Ages. Most people imagine medieval Europe as a time of simple beliefs, superstition, and ignorance, a period when rumors spread easily and truth was hard to find. And in many ways, that's accurate. But what often gets overlooked is how many of the wild stories people whispered about in those centuries, the ones dismissed as paranoid fantasy or religious hysteria, turned out to have some basis in reality, not always in the way people imagined, but real enough that when historians finally uncovered the evidence, they had to reconsider what they thought they knew. This isn't about proving every medieval rumor was true. It's about noticing how often the line between conspiracy and fact was thinner than anyone expected. People in the 1200s or 1400s didn't have newspapers or police reports or freedom of information laws. They had whispers, fragments of observation, and patterns they couldn't quite explain. And sometimes, those whispers were pointing at something genuine, even if the explanation was distorted by fear or misunderstanding. So we're going to move slowly through some of these stories tonight. Not the ones that stayed legends, but the ones that eventually became documented history. The kind of thing that makes you wonder what else people were quietly right about, even when no one believed them at the time. Let's start with something that seems almost too obvious now, but wasn't at all clear to people living through it. The idea that powerful families were secretly controlling entire regions through marriage and backroom deals. Today, we understand dynastic politics. We know the Habsburgs or the Medicis weren't just wealthy, they were running entire systems of influence that spanned countries. But if you were a peasant in 1300s France, and you noticed that the same handful of families seemed to hold every major title, every bishopric, every tax-collecting position, and you started saying out loud that these people were coordinating their power behind closed doors, you'd sound like a paranoid troublemaker. But they were. Not in smoky rooms with secret handshakes, but through arranged marriages, carefully negotiated treaties, and a web of obligations and debts that most people couldn't see. The conspiracy wasn't hidden because it was illegal. It was hidden because it was so normal to the people inside it that they didn't think of it as a conspiracy at all. To them, it was just how families protected their interests. To everyone outside, it looked like an invisible hand controlling everything. There are records, many of them kept in church archives or the personal letters of nobles, that show just how calculated this was. A duke would write to a bishop asking him to delay a certain legal case until after a particular marriage was finalized. A queen would coordinate with her brother, a king in another country, to make sure their children married into the right families. These weren't vague plans. They were detailed, multi-year strategies, and they worked. People at the time sensed it, but they didn't have proof, and proof was everything. Without documentation, you were just another complainer. Now, part of what made these conspiracies hard to prove was that medieval record-keeping was inconsistent. Some regions kept meticulous accounts, others barely kept any. And even when records existed, they were often written in Latin or legal shorthand that only a small percentage of people could read. So, when someone said, "I think the count and the abbot are working together to raise taxes and keep the money," they were probably right. But unless they could get their hands on a ledger, there was no way to demonstrate it. The conspiracy stayed invisible not because it was brilliantly hidden, but because the systems of transparency we take for granted didn't exist yet. Let's shift slightly to something more specific. There was a persistent belief in certain parts of medieval Europe that religious orders, particularly some of the monastic groups, were engaging in financial schemes that enriched them at the expense of ordinary believers. People would say things like, "The monks are lending money at interest," and calling it something else to avoid the church's rules against usury. And they were told that was slander, that monks were holy men devoted to poverty and prayer, and that these accusations were the work of envious or faithless people. Except it turned out to be true. Not everywhere, not all the time, but often enough that when historians started examining monastic financial records from the 13th and 14th centuries, they found evidence of exactly this kind of behavior. Monasteries would loan money to local landowners or merchants, but instead of charging interest directly, they'd structure the loan as a donation with an expected gift in return, or they'd take land as collateral and then claim it when the loan couldn't be repaid. Technically, this avoided the sin of usury. Practically, it was a way to accumulate wealth and property while maintaining a reputation for spiritual purity. People noticed this at the time. There are surviving complaints from town councils and local nobles who accused certain monasteries of predatory lending practices. But the church hierarchy often dismissed these complaints as attacks on the faith. And because the church controlled most of the legal infrastructure in medieval Europe, it was very difficult to bring a successful case against a monastery, even when the evidence was clear. The conspiracy wasn't that monks were secretly bankers. It was that the system protected them from accountability, and everyone sort of knew it but couldn't do much about it. What's interesting here is the gap between what people experienced and what they could prove. A farmer might lose his land to a monastery after defaulting on a loan that he knew was essentially interest-based, but he couldn't argue his case in a church court using the same logic that worked in his own mind. The legal definitions were written by the people who benefited from them. So the conspiracy was embedded in the structure itself, not hidden in some shadowy meeting. It was just the way things worked, and people who pointed it out were dismissed as troublemakers or heretics. This pattern, where the conspiracy is hiding in plain sight, protected by institutional language and legal definitions, shows up over and over in medieval history. It's not that people were too ignorant to notice. It's that noticing didn't lead to change unless you had power, and most people didn't. There's another category of medieval conspiracy that's worth spending time with, and it has to do with food supply and famine. In most medieval towns and cities, grain was the foundation of survival. Bread, porridge, beer, all of it depended on steady access to wheat, barley, or rye. And in times of shortage, prices would spike dramatically. People understood supply and demand in a practical sense, even if they didn't have the economic vocabulary for it. But what they also believed, and what they were often told was paranoid nonsense, was that grain merchants and local officials were deliberately withholding supplies to drive up prices and profit from artificial scarcity. Turns out, that happened constantly. There are documented cases across medieval Europe of grain hoarding schemes, where merchants with storage capacity would buy up grain during harvest, store it, and then release it slowly over the winter and spring when prices were highest. This wasn't illegal in most places, but it also wasn't something anyone involved wanted to advertise. When a town was on the edge of starvation and grain suddenly became available at triple the normal price, people suspected manipulation, and they were usually right. In some cases, local officials were directly involved. A town magistrate might have a financial interest in a warehouse, or a noble might have a deal with a merchant guild to split the profits from controlled releases of grain. These arrangements were rarely written down explicitly, because everyone involved knew they'd be unpopular, but they didn't need to be written down. The same families controlled the grain trade year after year, and they all understood the incentive structure. Keep supply tight, maximize profit, and if people complain, blame the weather or a bad harvest. What made this conspiratorial, rather than just cynical business practice, was the coordination. Merchants in different towns would sometimes sync their release schedules to prevent undercutting. Guilds would set informal price floors, and local officials would look the other way or even help enforce these arrangements in exchange for a cut. People in medieval towns noticed that prices seemed to spike at suspiciously convenient times, that grain appeared just before a riot but not before, and that the same merchants always seemed to have reserves when everyone else was desperate. They were told this was just how markets worked, but it wasn't. It was price fixing, and it was organized, and it killed people. The evidence for this kind of coordination shows up in trial records, particularly from periods of unrest when cities temporarily broke the power of merchant guilds and investigated their practices. In some cases, account books were seized that showed exactly how grain was moved and stored to manipulate supply. In other cases, testimony from guild members who'd fallen out of favor revealed how the schemes worked. But during the periods when these conspiracies were functioning smoothly, there was no investigation, no trial, and no record. Just hunger and suspicion. Now let's talk about something that sounds more dramatic but was just as real: the idea that certain powerful families were involved in organized poisoning. In the popular imagination, medieval poisoning is something out of a novel, a secret vial slipped into wine at a banquet, a dramatic death, a whispered accusation. And yes, that happened. But what people at the time believed, and what was dismissed as paranoid fantasy, was that poisoning was systematic, a tool used by political factions to eliminate rivals over time, often in ways that mimicked natural illness. This was true, particularly in Italy during the 14th and 15th centuries, but also in France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. There were families and political networks that employed poisoners as part of their standard toolkit. These weren't random assassinations. They were calculated removals of specific people who stood in the way of a land deal, a marriage alliance, or a political appointment. And because medical knowledge was limited, and because many poisons could be administered in small doses over time to simulate wasting diseases, it was very hard to prove. People noticed patterns. A rival who'd been healthy suddenly declined over months. A bishop who opposed a certain noble family developed a mysterious stomach ailment and died. A merchant who'd refused to sell his business got sick after a banquet and never recovered. Individually, these looked like bad luck or natural illness. Collectively, they looked like something else. And when people started saying out loud that certain families had poisoners on retainer, they were mocked or threatened with defamation charges. But they were right. We know this because some of these poisoners were eventually caught, either because they made a mistake or because they were betrayed by employers who no longer needed them. When they were interrogated, they described networks of suppliers, recipes for different kinds of poisons, methods for administration, and lists of previous targets. Some of these confessions were extracted under torture, so historians have to be careful about taking every detail at face value. But the core reality is clear. Poisoning was a tool, it was organized, and it was used more often than anyone wanted to admit. What makes this conspiratorial is the silence around it. Everyone in a certain social class knew it happened, but no one talked about it openly. It was one of those things where if you accused someone directly, you'd face legal consequences, but if you just quietly avoided eating at certain houses or drinking wine offered by certain people, that was considered prudent. The conspiracy wasn't hidden in the sense of being secret. It was hidden in the sense of being an open secret, something everyone knew but couldn't officially acknowledge. Let's move into a different area, one that involves the church more directly. There was a belief among many laypeople in medieval Europe that church officials were selling religious offices, bishoprics, abbacies, parish positions, to the highest bidder. This practice, called simony, was officially condemned by the church as a serious sin. Popes wrote letters against it. Church councils passed rules forbidding it. And yet, people kept insisting it was happening everywhere, that you couldn't become a bishop unless you paid for it, and that the church hierarchy was essentially a marketplace where spiritual authority was bought and sold. And they were right. Simony was rampant, particularly during certain periods like the 10th and 11th centuries, and again in the late 14th and 15th centuries. It wasn't always a direct cash payment. Sometimes it was a donation to a monastery, or a gift to a cardinal, or a promise of future support. But the transaction was clear. You wanted a church position, you provided something of value, and you got the position. The church condemned it in theory while participating in it in practice, and everyone involved knew this. But there was no mechanism to stop it because the people who would have enforced the rules were the same people benefiting from the system. Ordinary believers noticed because they saw incompetent or corrupt men elevated to positions of authority, not because of their faith or their learning, but because they had money or family connections. They saw parishes go to priests who barely understood Latin, who didn't live in their communities, who collected tithes but provided no spiritual care. And when they complained, they were told that these appointments were made through proper channels, that the men in question were qualified, and that questioning church leadership was bordering on heresy. But documentation survives. Letters between nobles arranging payments for church positions. Account books showing donations that coincided exactly with appointments. Testimony from church reformers who tried to fight simony and described in detail how it worked. The conspiracy wasn't hidden underground. It was woven into the administrative fabric of the church, and it stayed in place because the people with the power to end it had no incentive to do so. Part of what made these conspiracies difficult to challenge was that medieval society didn't have the same concept of transparency that we do now. There was no expectation that institutions would operate in the open, that decision-making processes would be documented, or that ordinary people had a right to know how power was being used. Secrecy wasn't seen as suspicious. It was normal. So when people suspected conspiracy, they were fighting against not just the specific scheme, but against an entire culture that treated opacity as the default setting. This is important because it explains why so many of these conspiracies were eventually confirmed not through medieval investigations, but through modern historical research. Scholars going through old archives, reading letters that were never meant to be public, cross-referencing financial records with appointment dates, tracing family connections across decades. The evidence was there all along, but it took centuries for anyone to have the tools and the access to put it together. Let's talk about something that involves a different kind of conspiracy: the manipulation of legal systems. In medieval Europe, law was fragmented. There was church law, royal law, local customary law, guild regulations, all of it overlapping and often contradictory. This created opportunities for people with knowledge and resources to manipulate outcomes in ways that ordinary people couldn't counter. And there was a widespread belief, particularly among peasants and craftsmen, that the law was rigged, that certain people could commit crimes or break contracts with impunity because they knew how to navigate the system or because they had protection from powerful patrons. This was absolutely true, and it was systematic. If you were a nobleman accused of a crime, you could demand trial by peers, which meant being judged by other nobles who had every incentive to protect one of their own. If you were a merchant with guild connections, you could have your case moved to a guild court where the rules favored commercial interests over those of individual buyers or workers. If you were a church official, you could claim benefit of clergy and have your case tried in an ecclesiastical court that had no power to impose secular punishment. People noticed that justice seemed to work differently depending on who you were. A peasant who stole a chicken might be hanged, while a knight who killed a peasant in a drunken fight might pay a fine or do penance. A laborer who failed to complete a contracted job might be imprisoned for breach of obligation, while a lord who refused to pay agreed wages might delay the case for years through procedural motions. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, but it was designed to protect the interests of people with power. There are trial records from medieval courts that show this pattern over and over. Cases dismissed on technicalities that only a trained lawyer would know to invoke. Witnesses who conveniently failed to appear when the defendant was well connected. Judges who delayed rulings until the plaintiff gave up or died. And when people accused the system of being corrupt, they were told they were being disrespectful to lawful authority, that they didn't understand the complexities of legal procedure, that justice required patience and faith in institutions. But the conspiracy wasn't that individual judges were corrupt, though some certainly were. It was that the structure of the legal system itself was conspiratorial, built to advantage certain groups and disadvantage others, and maintained by people who benefited from it staying that way. You didn't need a secret plot when the official rules already accomplished what a secret plot would aim to do. This connects to a broader theme that runs through many of these medieval conspiracies: the idea that power often hides in legitimacy. The most effective conspiracies aren't the ones conducted in darkness by masked figures. They're the ones conducted openly, under the cover of legal language, religious authority, or social custom. When the conspiracy is embedded in the system, you don't need secrecy. You just need people to accept that this is how things are supposed to work. Let's consider the medieval guild system, which is a perfect example of this. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants who controlled their trade in a particular town or region. They set quality standards, trained apprentices, and regulated prices. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, even beneficial. But what people outside the guilds believed, and what guild members denied, was that guilds were cartels designed to restrict competition, inflate prices, and keep outsiders from entering the market. And that's exactly what they were. Guilds controlled who could practice a trade by requiring years of apprenticeship, expensive masterwork projects, and membership fees that were often too high for anyone without family money. They set minimum prices to prevent undercutting. They coordinated with guilds in other towns to avoid competing with each other. They used their political influence to get laws passed that made it illegal to practice certain trades without guild membership. And they enforced all of this with both legal penalties and social ostracism. People who tried to work outside the guild system, who offered cheaper goods or services, who learned a trade without going through the official apprenticeship, were harassed, fined, and sometimes violently driven out of business. And when they complained that the guilds were a conspiracy against fair trade, they were told that guilds maintained standards, protected consumers, and honored tradition, all of which was partially true, but didn't change the fact that the primary function of guilds was to restrict supply and maximize profit for their members. We have guild records that document this explicitly: meeting minutes where members voted on price floors, agreements between guilds to divide markets geographically, lists of people who were blacklisted for trying to compete outside the system. The conspiracy was documented by the conspirators themselves, because from their perspective, they weren't conspiring. They were organizing, which was their right. But the effect was the same, a coordinated effort by a group of people to control an aspect of economic life for their own benefit at the expense of everyone else. What's notable is how long it took for anyone to challenge this system legally. In most medieval towns, guilds had enough political power that local governments wouldn't act against them. And since guilds were often intertwined with town councils, with guild masters serving as aldermen or magistrates, there was no clear separation between the regulators and the regulated. The conspiracy wasn't external to the government. It was the government, or at least a significant part of it. Now let's shift to something that involves information control, which is another recurring theme in medieval conspiracies. In a world where most people couldn't read, where books were rare and expensive, and where the church had a near monopoly on education, controlling information was a form of power. And there was a widespread belief among laypeople that the church was deliberately keeping certain knowledge restricted, not for spiritual reasons, but to maintain authority and prevent challenges to doctrine. This belief was grounded in reality. The church did restrict access to scripture, insisting that the Bible should only be read in Latin and interpreted by trained clergy. Translations into vernacular languages were often banned, and people caught with unauthorized translations could be accused of heresy. The official reason was that scripture was too complex and too sacred to be interpreted by untrained laypeople, who might misunderstand it and fall into error. But the practical effect was that ordinary Christians couldn't read the foundational text of their own religion without clerical mediation. People suspected, correctly, that this was about control as much as about theology. If you couldn't read the Bible yourself, you had to trust what the priest told you it said. And if the priest's interpretation served the interests of the church hierarchy, or if it justified practices like tithing or indulgences that enriched the church, you had no way to verify whether that interpretation was accurate. You just had to take it on faith, and dissent could be punished. There's extensive documentation of this. Church councils that explicitly forbade vernacular translations. Inquisition records of people prosecuted for possessing Bibles in their own language. Letters from bishops ordering the confiscation and burning of unauthorized texts. The church's position was clear and consistently enforced for centuries. And when people said this looked like a conspiracy to keep them ignorant and dependent, they were told they were being prideful, that they lacked the education and spiritual insight to understand Scripture properly, and that questioning the church's authority was a step toward damnation. But the conspiracy theory was validated over time, particularly as the printing press made books more accessible and as the Protestant Reformation broke the church's monopoly on biblical interpretation. When people finally did get access to Scripture in their own languages, they often discovered that some of the practices they'd been told were biblically mandated weren't actually in the text, or that the theological justifications they'd heard didn't hold up under scrutiny. The information control had been real, and it had been serving institutional interests, not just spiritual ones. This pattern, where limiting access to information serves to protect power, shows up in other medieval contexts too. Medical knowledge was often restricted to university-trained physicians who formed their own guilds and tried to prevent folk healers or women from practicing medicine. Legal knowledge was kept in Latin and in complex procedural forms that required years of training to navigate, which meant that most people couldn't represent themselves in court and had to hire lawyers who were often more loyal to the system than to their clients. In political information, details about treaties, tax revenues, military plans, was closely guarded by royal courts and noble councils, leaving ordinary people in the dark about decisions that directly affected their lives. In each case, the justification was that ordinary people weren't qualified to understand these complex matters, that they needed experts or authorities to manage things on their behalf. And in each case, people suspected that the real reason for secrecy was to prevent accountability and challenge. They were usually right, but proving it required access to the very information that was being withheld, which made it a nearly impossible circle to break. Let's talk about taxation, which might sound mundane but was the source of some of the most justified conspiracy theories in medieval life. People believed, and constantly complained, that taxes were higher than officially stated, that local officials were skimming money before it reached the royal treasury, and that the rates applied to peasants were harsher than those applied to nobles and clergy, despite official claims that everyone contributed fairly. All of this was true. Medieval tax collection was a privatized, decentralized mess. Kings and lords would farm out tax collection to local officials or contractors who were expected to deliver a certain amount to the treasury, but could keep whatever they collected above that amount. This created an obvious incentive to overtax, and there was very little oversight. A tax collector could claim the king demanded 10% when the actual rate was 5%, pocket the difference, and who would know? Peasants couldn't go check the royal decree themselves. They couldn't audit the collector's accounts. They just had to pay what they were told to pay or face penalties. And the penalties were real. Failure to pay taxes could mean confiscation of property, imprisonment, or in some cases, being sold into temporary servitude to work off the debt. So even when people suspected they were being cheated, they often paid anyway because the consequences of refusal were too severe. The system relied on information asymmetry and on the threat of force, and it worked for centuries. We know this happened because occasionally, when a region revolted or when a particularly corrupt official was brought down for unrelated reasons, investigators would look into the tax records and find discrepancies. They discover that the amount collected was far higher than the amount delivered to the treasury, or that certain families were mysteriously exempt while others paid triple the official rate. But these investigations were rare, and even when corruption was exposed, it was usually treated as the fault of a few bad individuals rather than a systemic problem. The conspiracy theory, that the tax system was rigged to exploit the poor while protecting the wealthy, wasn't paranoia. It was an accurate description of how the system functioned. But because the people who could have changed the system were the same people benefiting from it, nothing changed. The conspiracy continued, generation after generation, justified by claims of administrative necessity and royal authority. Another area worth exploring is the relationship between medieval cities and the extraction of resources from surrounding rural areas. People in the countryside often believed that cities were exploiting them, setting trade rules that forced farmers to sell cheap and buy expensive, using their political power to divert resources and labor, and generally treating rural areas as colonies to be mined for wealth. City dwellers and urban merchants would dismiss this as rural resentment or ignorance about how trade worked. But the rural people were mostly correct. Medieval cities often had legal privileges that gave them advantages over rural producers. A city might have a monopoly on certain kinds of trade, meaning farmers had to sell their grain in the city market rather than directly to buyers, which gave city merchants control over prices. Cities could impose tolls on roads and rivers, making it expensive to transport goods while exempting their own merchants from the same fees. And cities often had political representation, seats in assemblies or councils, while rural areas did not, which meant policies were made by and for urban interests. There are records of disputes between cities and rural regions that show this tension explicitly. Farmers complaining that they were required to sell at below-market prices. Villages protesting toll increases that made it unprofitable to bring goods to market. Rural craftsmen arguing that city guilds were illegally preventing them from selling their products. And in most cases, the cities won these disputes because they had better lawyers, more money, and more political influence. This wasn't a conspiracy in the sense of being secret. It was official policy, enshrined in city charters and regional laws. But it was conspiratorial in the sense of being coordinated, deliberate, and designed to transfer wealth from one group to another in a way that the advantaged group denied was happening. City leaders would talk about fair trade and mutual benefit while implementing rules that systematically favored urban merchants over rural producers. The conspiracy was hiding in the legal language. Let's talk about something slightly different: the role of royal agents and informants. In many medieval kingdoms, particularly in England and France, there was a network of people who reported to the crown about local activities, potential rebellions, economic conditions, anything the king wanted to know. These informants were often local officials, clergy, or merchants who had reason to stay in the king's good graces. And there was a widespread belief among ordinary people that they were being spied on, that casual conversations in taverns or markets were being reported to authorities, and that expressing dissent, even in private, was dangerous. This belief was well-founded. Royal governments did maintain networks of informants, and they did use information gathered this way to preempt rebellions, identify critics, and control local populations. There are royal account books that show payments to informants, letters from spies reporting on local sentiment, in cases where people were arrested based on things they said in supposedly private conversations. The surveillance wasn't universal or all-seeing, but it was real, and it was effective enough that people learned to be very careful about what they said and to whom. What made this conspiratorial was the secrecy. Informants didn't identify themselves. You didn't know if your neighbor, your parish priest, or the merchant you traded with was reporting to the crown. And because the system worked best when people were unsure, authorities encouraged paranoia, occasionally arresting someone based on private speech just to remind everyone that walls had ears. The conspiracy was less about what was actually being done and more about the climate of fear and uncertainty it created. This system of surveillance and informants tied into broader mechanisms of social control in medieval society. People were expected to monitor each other, to report suspicious behavior, to participate in maintaining order. And while some of this was community-based and voluntary, a lot of it was encouraged or mandated by authorities who understood that a population that policed itself was easier to control than one that had to be constantly monitored from above. Let's move to a topic that connects several of these threads: the financing of the Crusades. People in medieval Europe were told that the Crusades were holy wars, undertaken to reclaim Jerusalem and defend Christianity from Muslim expansion. And for many of the knights and common soldiers who went, that was probably their primary motivation. But there was also a widespread belief, particularly among those who didn't go, that the Crusades were as much about wealth and power as about religion, that they were opportunities for landless nobles to carve out estates in the East, for Italian merchants to establish profitable trade routes, and for the church to increase its influence and revenues. And this was true. The Crusades had religious motivations, but they also had very clear economic and political dimensions that benefited specific groups. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa provided ships and supplies for Crusader armies, and in exchange, they got trade concessions and footholds in eastern Mediterranean ports. Knights who joined the Crusades could acquire land and titles that would have been impossible to get in Europe. And the church raised enormous sums through special taxes and indulgences tied to the Crusades, money that funded not just military campaigns but also church-building projects and administrative expenses back in Europe. People at the time noticed that crusade preaching often coincided with church fundraising drives, that certain merchants seemed to profit enormously from crusade-related trade, and that the motivations of Crusader leaders didn't always seem very holy. There are contemporary chronicles and letters that express cynicism about the Crusades, questioning whether they were really about faith or whether they were glorified looting expeditions. And while church authorities insisted on the sacred nature of the enterprise, the evidence suggests that many participants understood the economic incentives perfectly well. This isn't to say the Crusades were a conspiracy in the sense of being entirely fabricated or cynically manipulated from the start. Religious belief was genuine for many people, but the belief that there were ulterior motives, that powerful groups were benefiting financially and politically from the Crusades while ordinary people paid the costs, that was accurate. And it was a conspiracy in the sense that no one in authority wanted to acknowledge this openly, because doing so would undermine the legitimacy of the whole enterprise. There's a pattern here that applies to many medieval conspiracies. They often had an official justification that was partially true, but they also had hidden or unacknowledged dimensions that served the interests of the people promoting them. And when ordinary people noticed the gap between the official story and the reality they observed, they were told they were being cynical or faithless or that they didn't understand the bigger picture. But they understood perfectly well. They just lacked the power to do anything about it. Let's consider the practice of enclosure, which started in the late medieval period and continued into the early modern era. Enclosure was the process by which common lands, fields, pastures, and forests that had traditionally been used collectively by village communities were fenced off and converted to private property, usually by local lords or wealthy landowners. The official justification was that private ownership would lead to more efficient farming, better land management, and increased productivity. But the people who lost access to common lands believed this was just an excuse for the rich to steal land that had belonged to the community for generations. They were right. Enclosure was, in most cases, a transfer of wealth from poor to rich, justified by economic theories that served the interests of landowners. Common lands had been essential for the survival of many peasant families. They grazed their animals there, gathered firewood, foraged for food. When those lands were enclosed, those families lost a crucial part of their subsistence base. Some were forced to become wage laborers. Some migrated to cities. Some starved. The people implementing enclosure knew this would happen. There are letters and documents from landowners discussing how to legally enclose commons, how to compensate or bypass existing customary rights, how to manage resistance from displaced peasants. This wasn't an accidental consequence. It was the point. Enclosure was about consolidating control over land and transforming agricultural systems in ways that benefited property owners at the expense of everyone else. And when peasants protested, they were often told that they were standing in the way of progress, that they didn't understand economics, that private property was more efficient and everyone would benefit in the long run. But everyone didn't benefit. A small group of landowners benefited. Everyone else lost. The conspiracy theory that enclosure was a scheme by the rich to rob the poor was just an accurate description of what was happening. But because the people doing it controlled the legal system and had the backing of economic and political authorities, there was no recourse. This connects to a broader point about how conspiracies function in systems with extreme inequality. When the gap between rich and poor is enormous, when political power is concentrated in the hands of a small elite, you don't need elaborate secret plots. You just need people with power to act in their own interests, and as long as they control the mechanisms of law and force, they can do so openly. The conspiracy is the system itself. Now let's talk about something that's more directly related to individual safety. The belief that certain inns and taverns were operated by criminals who robbed or killed guests. This was a common fear among medieval travelers, and it was often dismissed as superstition or exaggeration. After all, innkeeping was a legitimate business, regulated by local authorities, and most innkeepers were presumably honest. But there were cases, documented cases, of inns that functioned as fronts for robbery or worse. The most famous example is probably the case of certain inns in France during the 100 Years' War, where travelers would be lodged in rooms with trapdoors or collapsible floors that dropped them into cellars, where they'd be robbed and murdered. Their possessions would be sold, and their bodies would be disposed of. This went on for years in some locations before authorities finally investigated and uncovered the operations. By that point, dozens of people had disappeared. We know this happened because there are trial records. Innkeepers and their accomplices were eventually caught and prosecuted, and their confessions describe the methods in detail. What's striking is how organized it was. These weren't opportunistic crimes. They were systematic operations, with inns specifically designed for the purpose, with established methods for disposing of evidence, and with networks of accomplices who helped sell the stolen goods. And they persisted because travelers who went missing were often assumed to have been victims of bandits on the road, or to have simply moved on without notice. People suspected that some inns were dangerous, but proof was hard to come by until someone actually got caught. And because most innkeepers were legitimate, blanket suspicion was seen as unfair and paranoid. But the paranoia wasn't entirely irrational. There were enough real cases that being cautious about where you stayed was actually good survival strategy. The conspiracy theory was justified, even if it didn't apply to every inn. This illustrates something important about medieval conspiracies more broadly. The absence of reliable institutions meant that people had to rely on rumor, pattern recognition, and instinct to navigate risks. And sometimes those instincts were pointing at real dangers, even when there was no way to prove them in advance. The conspiracy wasn't that every inn was a death trap. It was that some inns were, and you couldn't always tell which ones, and authorities weren't necessarily going to protect you. Let's spend some time on a conspiracy that involved the church and state working together, the suppression of heretical movements. Official church teaching held that heresy was a spiritual disease that needed to be rooted out for the good of society. Heretics were dangerous not just to their own souls but to the souls of others, and therefore they needed to be identified, given a chance to recant, and if they refused, punished. This was presented as a necessary defense of truth and order. But people in regions where heresy hunts were active, particularly in southern France during the Albigensian Crusade or in various parts of Europe during the Inquisition, believed that heresy charges were being used as a pretext to seize property, settle personal scores, and eliminate political rivals. And they were absolutely correct. Heresy prosecution was often about power and money, not theology. When someone was convicted of heresy, their property was typically confiscated, divided between the church and the local secular authorities. This created an obvious financial incentive to find heretics, and it led to waves of accusations in regions where there was valuable property to be seized. People noticed that heresy charges seemed to disproportionately target the wealthy, that accusations often followed disputes over land or business, and that once someone was accused, they had very little chance of defending themselves because the Inquisition operated under rules that heavily favored the prosecution. There are Inquisition records that confirm this pattern. Cases where the accused person's property is mentioned explicitly in the proceedings. Letters between church officials and secular authorities discussing how to divide confiscated assets. Testimony from people who admitted under torture to being heretics, but who clearly had no theological understanding of the heresies they were supposedly practicing. The conspiracy wasn't that heresy didn't exist. It was that heresy prosecution was a tool that could be and was regularly weaponized for purposes that had nothing to do with defending the faith. And when people said this out loud, they were told they were defending heretics, that they didn't understand the danger heresy posed, that questioning the Inquisition was itself suspicious. But they understood perfectly well. They understood that the system was corrupt, that it was being used to enrich and empower authorities at the expense of ordinary believers, and that theological justifications were cover for something much more cynical. The conspiracy theory was accurate. The official narrative was the lie. This pattern, where religious authority is used to legitimize actions that serve secular interests, appears throughout medieval history. The church and state weren't always aligned, but when they found common cause in suppressing dissent or extracting resources or maintaining control, the combination was extremely powerful and very difficult to resist. People suspected coordination, and they were right to suspect it, because the coordination was real, documented in correspondence and agreements between bishops and kings, between inquisitors and magistrates, between popes and emperors. Let's talk about something that seems small but mattered a lot to people's daily lives: the quality of bread and other basic goods. In medieval towns, bakers, brewers, and other producers of essential goods were supposed to be regulated by guilds and town authorities to ensure fair weights and honest quality. But people constantly suspected that they were being cheated, that bread loaves were underweight, that beer was watered down, that flour was adulterated with cheaper ingredients. And they were told that these suspicions were unfair to honest tradesmen, that regulations were in place to prevent such things, that occasional mistakes happened but systematic fraud was not occurring. Except it was. Town records are full of cases of bakers caught selling underweight loaves, brewers caught diluting their product, millers caught skimming flour. These weren't isolated incidents. They were common enough that towns had to establish regular inspections and severe penalties, and even then, fraud continued. The financial incentive was too strong. If you could make a loaf 10% smaller without customers noticing immediately, and if you could do that for every loaf you sold, the profit added up quickly. People noticed. They noticed that loaves seemed smaller than they used to be, that bread didn't seem as filling, that the weights didn't match what was advertised. And when they complained, they were often dismissed or told they were misremembering, that times were hard and ingredients were expensive, that they should be grateful for what they had. But the fraud was real, and it was widespread, and it persisted because enforcement was inconsistent and because guild members often protected each other. This might seem minor compared to poisonings or political conspiracies, but it mattered because it affected everyone, every day. If you were a laborer living on the edge of subsistence, being cheated on the weight of your bread could mean going hungry. If you were a housewife managing a tight household budget, being sold adulterated flour could mean your family didn't eat as well. The conspiracy wasn't dramatic, but it was constant, and it eroded trust in the basic institutions of daily life. And what made it conspiratorial, rather than just ordinary fraud, was the way guild structures protected members from accountability. If a baker was caught cheating, his guild might pay the fine for him or negotiate a reduced penalty. If a town inspector was too aggressive in enforcement, guild members might complain to the town council and get him removed. The conspiracy was built into the system, a network of mutual protection that put the interests of producers above those of consumers, and that operated openly while denying that it was doing anything wrong. Let's return to the idea of royal courts and the way decisions were made there. People outside the court, nobles who weren't in favor, merchants trying to get royal charters, ordinary petitioners seeking justice, often believed that the court was dominated by a small group of advisors who controlled access to the king, who made decisions in his name, and who enriched themselves through their positions. They were told that the king ruled wisely with counsel from his loyal servants, that decisions were made according to law and custom, and that suspicions of corruption or manipulation were unfounded. But court politics were exactly as conspiratorial as people suspected. Royal courts were full of factions competing for influence, of advisors who enriched themselves through bribes and kickbacks, of decisions made based on personal loyalty rather than merit or justice. There are countless examples from medieval history of royal favorites who accumulated enormous wealth and power, who controlled appointments and policy, and who operated with impunity until they fell out of favor or until the king died and the next regime purged them. These weren't secret conspiracies. They were the normal functioning of court politics. But from the outside, if you were trying to get the king's attention for a legitimate grievance or opportunity, and you kept being blocked by courtiers who demanded payment or who told you that your case wasn't a priority, it looked like conspiracy. And it was. Not in the sense of being hidden, but in the sense of being a coordinated effort by a group of insiders to control access and extract value. Medieval chroniclers wrote about this. They described courts as places of intrigue and corruption, where truth and justice were less important than favor and gold. And they were often writing from personal experience, having observed or participated in court politics themselves. The conspiracy theory that courts were controlled by cabals of self-interested advisors who manipulated kings for their own benefit was just an accurate description of how courts actually worked. But people in power would never admit it, because doing so would undermine the legitimacy of royal authority. Now let's talk about something that connects to several of these themes: the use of debt as a tool of control. In medieval society, credit and debt were fundamental to economic life. Peasants borrowed seed grain to plant crops. Craftsmen borrowed money to buy tools. Merchants borrowed to finance trade ventures. And nobles borrowed enormous sums to fund wars, build castles, or maintain their lifestyles. This created complex webs of obligation, and it also created opportunities for manipulation and exploitation. People at the time believed that creditors, particularly wealthy merchants and bankers, were deliberately trapping debtors in cycles of repayment that they could never escape, using interest and penalties to ensure that debts grew faster than they could be paid off. They believed that this was a conspiracy by the wealthy to essentially enslave the poor, turning free people into permanent servants through the mechanism of debt. And they were largely correct. Medieval lending practices, particularly for small loans to poor people, were often predatory. Interest rates were high, penalties for missed payments were severe, and loan terms were structured to make full repayment difficult. If you borrowed money to survive a bad harvest, you might spend the next several years working to pay off the debt, and if you missed a payment, the debt could balloon to the point where you'd never pay it off. Some creditors preferred this, because a debtor who could never fully repay was a source of ongoing labor and payments. There are court records of debt cases where people had been paying for years or even decades on loans that should have been settled much earlier, but where penalties and compound interest had kept the debt alive. There are cases where creditors deliberately delayed court proceedings or manipulated accounting to prevent debtors from clearing their obligations. And there are cases where entire families were trapped in debt servitude, with children inheriting their parents' debts and working them off in turn. The conspiracy here wasn't hidden. The loan terms were written down, the interest rates were stated, the penalties were specified. But the system was designed to favor creditors, and poor people often had no choice but to accept unfavorable terms because the alternative was starvation. And when they complained that the system was rigged against them, they were told that debt was a personal responsibility, that they should have managed their finances better, that creditors had a right to collect what they were owed. But the reality was that the system was structured to transfer wealth upward, from poor debtors to wealthy creditors, in a way that was legally sanctioned and socially accepted. The conspiracy wasn't illegal. It was the law, and it persisted because the people with the power to change it were the same people who benefited from it. There's something important to notice about all of these examples. In almost every case, the conspiracy was hiding in plain sight, operating through official channels, justified by legal or religious or economic rationales that made it seem legitimate. The people who suspected conspiracy weren't paranoid. They were observant. They noticed patterns, they saw who benefited and who suffered, and they drew reasonable conclusions. The problem was that observation and reasonable conclusions weren't enough to change systems that were designed to protect themselves. Medieval society didn't have the mechanisms for transparency and accountability that modern societies claim to have. There were no free press, no independent investigators, no systems for citizens to challenge institutional power. So, conspiracies could operate openly, because there was no one with both the knowledge and the power to expose them and force change. People knew, but knowing didn't matter unless you could do something with that knowledge, and most people couldn't. This is why so many of these conspiracies were only confirmed centuries later, when historians went through old records with fresh eyes and different questions. The evidence was always there. It just wasn't accessible at the time, or it was accessible but couldn't be acted on, or it was acted on but suppressed. The conspiracy wasn't that powerful groups were hiding their actions. It was that powerful groups had structured society so that their actions didn't need to be hidden. As we've moved through these different examples, a pattern has emerged. Medieval conspiracies weren't usually elaborate plots conducted in secret by shadowy figures. They were systematic arrangements by people with power to benefit themselves at the expense of others, operating through institutions that they controlled or influenced. The conspiracies were structural, not secret. They were maintained not through silence, but through legitimacy, through claims that this is just how things work, that this is necessary, that this is proper and lawful and even divinely ordained. And the people who challenged these narratives, who said out loud that the system was corrupt or unfair or rigged, were dismissed as troublemakers, heretics, or fools. But they were right, not about every detail, not in every case, but right enough that when historians finally examined the evidence, the conspiracies were confirmed. The people who were called paranoid were actually just paying attention. This has implications for how we think about conspiracy theories more broadly. Not all conspiracies are real, obviously. Not every suspicious pattern points to actual coordination, but some do. And the fact that powerful institutions routinely lie, cover up, and act in their own interests while claiming to serve the common good means that skepticism isn't irrational. It's appropriate. Medieval people were right to suspect that they were being exploited and misled, because they were. The tragedy was that being right didn't protect them, because the systems were too powerful and too entrenched to be changed by mere knowledge.